Okay, let's do it.
When you're faced with an overwhelming incoming stream of unrelated tasks, you don't have enough margin in your schedule to create smarter alternative workflows. There's just too much bombarding you to individually tame everything with optimized processes. In other words, when playing defense against an onslaught of unpredictable obligations, ad hoc, unstructured communication soon becomes the only reasonable option to prevent yourself from drowning. This reality creates a nasty, productivity sapping circularity. When you're overloaded, you're forced to fall back on the flexibility of the hive mind. This workflow, however, leads to an even more fragmentation of your attention, making you even less efficient in getting things done. The result? Overload increases.
As the spiral continues, you'll eventually end up in an overwhelmed state of inefficient desperation,
where the idea that you can somehow carefully engineer smarter workflows seems impossible. That was an excerpt from Cal Newport's latest book, A World Without Email. And while it is a very clear, lucid, and unfortunately familiar description of what work often feels like for many of us, there's one particular elephant in the room that we want to focus on. It's a single word. You actually heard it 3 times in that excerpt alone, and it's used almost 200 times in the entirety of the book. This word will undoubtedly replace the now stained term productivity over the next 5 years, though, as I hope to explain, it differs greatly in meaning. To some, this word conveys a cold, mechanical process, while oddly to others, it expresses fluidity, ease, and the path towards creativity. That word is workflow. Hi, I'm Andy Hickman, behavioral coach and author of The Art of Workflow, and it's time to get crystal clear on exactly what workflow is and is not. World Without Email really is a fantastic book, but it does have some quirks. Besides its unmerited accusation against Peter Drucker and a truly baffling downplay of David Allen, both of which I hope to get to on a later video, it chooses to place the definition of the most primary term in the entire book really late. If you've read the book, you know how central the terms knowledge work and knowledge worker are in the book, and yet the instances of both of those terms combined are still less than the term workflow. In fact, workflow is used 198 times in the entire book. Yet it's not until almost halfway through the book that that term is defined. On page 110, Newport writes the following: knowledge work is better understood as a combination of 2 components, work execution and workflow. The first component, work execution, describes the act of actually executing the underlying value-producing activities of knowledge work. The programmer coding, the publicist writing the press release. It's how you generate value from attention capital. The second component, workflow, is one we defined in the introduction of this book. It describes how these fundamental activities are identified, assigned, coordinated, and reviewed. The hyperactive hive mind is a workflow, as is Devesh's project board system. If work execution is what generates value, then workflows are what structure these efforts. Now, you may have heard in that excerpt Newport claiming that workflow was defined in the introduction of the book. It simply wasn't. It is used when laying out the term hyperactive hive mind workflow, but it itself is not defined until 42% of the way through the book. I even noted this on my first read when he lays out the definition of hyperactive hive mind workflow, sensing it a little bit odd that in that moment, workflow is not defined. The delayed definition we do get at 110 is good. It's worth our time, but we can squeeze so much more juice out of this lemon, and it's really critical that we do so. As rightly noted by Newport in the introduction, the intentional scientific study of workflow is both, quote, inevitable and, quote, a coming revolution, end quote. Then also bookending with this topic of workflow, in the last section of the book titled The 21st Century Moonshot, Newport writes the following about workflow on page 261. He says, this, quote, this has to be one of the most exciting and impactful challenges that almost no one is talking about yet, end quote. Fortunately, a lot of the groundwork has been done for us in the field of workflow, and much of it predates this book, A World Without Email, and it's been done by writers and thinkers that we'll explore in later videos on this channel. But it is accurate to point out that workflow as a concept is extremely rare in popular conversation. Part of this is due to the fact that the vocabulary within this field is still not really settled. It's not final. Unlike Latin, for example, which is a dead language and isn't going through any fluctuation, the terms, the vocabulary around or within the field of workflow is still in development. The purpose of this video is to stabilize the word workflow and consequently enable it to be discussed more popularly. So let's now explore 8 things that workflow is and is not. Number 1, workflow is the ordering of work. Although workflow does entail work itself, it might be simplest or easiest to approach it first as something distinct from work. Workflow is meta work. It arranges, orchestrates, guides work itself. Workflow both is and is not productivity. It is productivity in the sense that it does result in increased efficiency and creative output, but it's not productivity in 2 senses. First, while productivity is associated with sort of cheap or surface level hacks and tricks, the roots of workflow are significantly more deep and universal in application. Secondly, workflow's scope is much broader. It touches on efficiency, yes, absolutely, but that really isn't the central focus. Efficiency really is a tiny dot in a much broader integrated whole. And that's a good transition to number 2. Workflow is holistic. It's not just about prioritizing the tasks that happen to be in front of you, but it also involves the practice of generating ideas and then transforming them into new tasks. But it's not just about executing tasks. It's also about cultivating your own thought. The actions of, say, studying a topic or writing a paper or crafting a poem all fall under the umbrella of workflow. Workflow is not just about optimizing your current volume of inputs, but it also entails making changes upstream that affect the volume of inputs downstream. I think this one shakes things up a bit. It's not just about organizing. It's also about how to shape and define the ideas that are in your head. I listened to a podcast recently, and she was given advice on how to organize one's to-do list. And her advice was, take your to-do list and take the contents of that to-do list, and instead of putting it on one sheet, have 3 different categories that you put those contents on. And I think the categories were like something that's urgent, something that needs to be cultivated, and something that needs to be, I don't know. I'm not sure what the 3rd category was. That's not the point. The point is that there was no questions being asked about what is already on the to-do list. It was just a reshuffling of that content into different kind of categories. And this is a really big problem that a lot of people fall into, which is trying to apply organization to things that are still unclear. Workflow is not a system, it's an ecosystem. It is not a linear sequence of 4 behaviors, but rather a harmonious habituation of them. Workflow is also a synthesis of thought across time and culture. Unfortunately, there tends to be a pattern of a pendulum swing that goes back and forth. One thing that's on the front of my mind as I'm recording this video is the good writings of David Allen, who, in justified frustration against the principles or productivity advice being offered at his time, the common stuff, he pushed back against what was phrased time management. And in place of that, proposed something called action management. Now, action management was really important, and we can kind of get into that later, but it was unnecessary to toss aside the advances and really the significant insight in the field of time management that preceded David Allen. And workflow steps aside and doesn't make that same kind of mistake. It respects the insight of those that has come before it, and it seeks to synthesize across disciplines, across writers and thinkers, rather than to dissect and arbitrarily oppose lines of thought. One might think, for example, that we would limit ourselves to the writings within the modern age, and that's precisely what we don't do. We certainly incorporate writings from modern thinkers, but we also incorporate writers from medieval and ancient time as well, including Aristotle, Aquinas, many others. An unfortunate phrase that gets tossed around a lot is this phrase, your mind is for having ideas, not holding them. And though it's not intrinsically connected with that phrase, often a philosophical line of thought starts to marry with that popular phrase and starts to drive almost a suspicion of natural intelligence, a rejection of it in favor of something that is viewed to be more trustworthy, more sophisticated, and more scalable, which is artificial intelligence. Well, both of these are good things, and so workflow harmonizes both of them. It views the hard to pin down abilities of the human mind to think, to intuit, to reflect, to associate as good things, almost precisely because they aren't measurable. And yet it doesn't reject the advances of artificial intelligence. Marrying these two things together is very much like the practice of breathing that involves both inhaling and exhaling. If one were simply to take one of those, for example, maybe to only exhale, eventually you pass out. Number 3, workflow is for any kind of work. And maybe it's worth our time to pause on that word, work. If you close your eyes and imagine in your mind that concept, work, what exactly do you imagine? However you answer that question is really significant, because I would give a lot of money to bet that what we are talking about within workflow is much broader than maybe what we initially imagine. And it really isn't limited to the type of work that we see today. For example, if we leave the information age, which we are in, and travel back into, say, the industrial age or the agricultural age, it's not as if they weren't using workflow back then. They certainly were. It's just the shape and look and maybe feel of workflow changed. As a quick aside, there will be videos exploring the history of workflow. Maybe if that's something that's of particular interest to you, you could mention that in the comments. That might help me understand which order would be best to release some of these videos. Workflow is for both personal and professional work. My wife Liz and I just recently had the joy of welcoming our third daughter into this world. Her name is Anastasia. And for almost a year, probably actually more than a year leading up to this birth, Liz and I maintained a list called Have an Amazing Birth Experience. Now, this list resulted in a whole bunch of stuff. But in addition to all those things, it resulted in a very beautiful and intimate moment the night before Anastasia was born. Having both finished reading books on birthing and then also kind of processing notes that we had taken on those books, Liz and I found ourselves in a kind of just quiet and welcoming state of mind. That night we spent the evening simply chatting. I was combing Liz's hair as we talked about different concepts that resonated within the books, different cues or phrases that we plan to use with each other during the birth of Anastasia. It really felt like time had faded away. And what was happening at the time, though we weren't fully conscious of it, was a very warm and welcoming dynamic was being fertilized there between Liz and I, right on the eve of Anastasia arriving. Now, I am beyond biased, but to me, this is a perfect example of what we mean by workflow is for any kind of work. It's not just about corporate efficiency, though it certainly touches on that. It's about ordering our lives so that we can better love and be loved.